18 years. I've been doing advocacy work on missing murdered women in Canada. And unfortunately, I got started in this direction when I was about 22 years old. And I got started in it because a girl I worked on the streets with as a sex worker was brutally murdered. And the police claimed it was an accident. And that's what inspired me to become an advocate for missing murdered women. So for many years, I advocated for missing or survivor sex workers and taught at colleges and universities. And the last couple of years, I've been doing a lot on missing murdered Native women in Canada and actually showing how the two are actually connected. So this is an iconic picture that best describes the relationship between First Nations people and the RCMP. The Queen of England invented the RCMP to steal land from the First Nations. When the Prairie Natives refused to give over the land, the RCMP killed off the buffalo and starved them into submission. The RCMP told them if they signed over the land to the Queen of England, they would get fed. This picture was taken in 2013 in New Brunswick. An American fracking corporation decided to go on to Mi'kmaq territory and destroy their land for profit. The First Nations people from across Canada showed up to help the Mi'kmaq defend their land, and they were greeted by over 1,400 armed RCMP. They were assaulted, shot at, arrested, and all for trying to stop American corporations from destroying their land. And some of the warriors who were involved in this are still in prison now, actually, who are actually facing a couple of years in prison. There's another picture I have with this, actually, and it has something else. It says, go back to whatever. Another picture of this, and it's interesting. It says the only time you can get this many RCMP to pay attention to a First Nations woman is in the name of oil and gas. You could never get this many RCMP together in one spot to look for a missing murdered Native woman in Canada. And that's actually very true. And you'll see why. This is the RCMP. We did up a thing here on how the RCMP blame Indigenous women for their disappearance. So the RCMP believe that Indigenous women are disappearing because they're highly likely to be unemployed, they're more likely to be drug addicts, alcoholics, they're more likely to be involved in criminal activity, they're more likely to have criminal records, and more likely to be involved in the sex trade. And so this is the RCMP's, mentality as to why Indigenous women are going missing. And if you look at it all, they're blaming the victim. So here's some basically stats we have here, and one of the biggest ones I actually made this slide personally is that Indigenous women are 5 times more likely to go missing or get murdered in Canada than any other ethnic group in Canada. And so knowing that, so we know Indigenous women are highly more likely to go missing or get murdered. So why are Indigenous women over-policed and unprotected? An Indigenous woman will see the inside of a jail cell before she ever sees the inside of a college classroom. When Indigenous people go to prison, they're more likely put into maximum security. They'll deal with a lot of racism and discriminations in prison. So looking at that, basically showing how they're over-policed and then showing underneath how they're underprotected. So this is an example of why our Indigenous women are going missing and going murdered in Canada. And there's a Native woman who went missing in Vancouver Island called Angela Pete. And the RCMP only searched for her for 7 years because there was a warrant for her arrest. And the Crown kept her file alive for 7 years because there was a warrant for her arrest. If there was no warrant for her arrest, they never would put that much time effort into looking for her. So they didn't look for Angela Pete because she was missing and she might be murdered. They were looking for her to arrest her because they thought she was a criminal. This is Connie Jacobs. This is in Alberta. In 1998, Connie Jacobs, she had 9 kids. And she lived on one of the reserves just outside Calgary, Alberta. And social services kept showing up and stealing her children. And so the last time they showed up in 1998, Connie Jacobs greeted them with a shotgun at the door and said, "You're not taking my children from me." So the social worker called the tribal police. The tribal police called the Okotoks RCMP. When the Okotoks RCMP showed up, their first response to an Indigenous woman holding a gun to protect her children from the state stealing them again was the RCMP shot her. The bullet went through Connie Jacobs, and her son Ty was behind her, and it hit her son, her 9-year-old son, and killed her, and killed both of them. So the RCMP's job was to show up and protect these children from their mother, and in the end, they ended up killing one. Oh yes, I have some. First Nations women are over-policed and unprotected because police have been conditioned to view them as disposable. For an example, Canadian police will hunt down a First Nations woman if there's a warrant for arrest, but not put the same kind of effort if she's considered missing. In 2008, a First Nation woman called the Vancouver Police Department for help. They responded by arresting her, throwing her in a jail cell where guards tied up her feet and left her in severe pain for hours. In 2011, a 17-year-old First Nations girl believed her life was in danger and called the police. When the Williams Lake RCMP showed up, they handcuffed the girl, threw her in the cruiser, and repeatedly punched her in the face. In 2015, 8 Quebec provincial police constables were suspended for allegations of sexual assault, sexual misconduct, and other abuses against First Nations women and girls. Police will continue to commit crimes like these ones against our women until they deal with the sexism, racism, and misogyny that has plagued their institution. If there's no evidence of any kind of systemic change, then our First Nations women and girls are left to believe that one of the predators they have to watch out for are the ones who carry guns for a living and wear uniforms. Next. This is a real big case about how Human Rights Watch came down. And they talked to, as we know, at least over 50 women, missing and murdered on the Highway of Tears. And now they have evidence to prove that the RCMP are actually responsible for some of them. So Human Rights Watch came from New York City, came down, and interviewed the girls and everything, interviewed all the family, and then did up a report on it. And it was submitted to the Canadian government. It's also submitted to the Missing Women's Inquiry. And about, and that's the sad part. Like, we think there's serial killers taking our women. It turns out our own police are actually involved in it. Next. This is a well-known case where in Manitoba, an RCMP officer arrested an intoxicated First Nations woman and took her to a jail cell. And for some reason decided that because he arrested her, he could do what he wanted with her, and decided to take her home and have sex with her. And the only reason it didn't happen, and he actually got the girl in his car and was driving home with her, when another RCMP constable called the sergeant, and the sergeant called the other cop and told him, drop the girl off at her home, and then you better get back to the station. Now here's the sad part. Nothing ever happened as a result of this, and the police officer that was involved in this now just got stationed in New Brunswick to work with the Mi'kmaq territory, where God knows what he's going to be doing over there. Next. So we start to ask questions like, under a colonial capitalist society, can there ever be justice for our missing murdered Indigenous women and girls? This is a famous picture here in Toronto where they stopped trains to demand an inquiry into our missing murdered women when Stephen Harper was our Prime Minister. And then this is Cindy Gladue, and everyone knows about the Cindy Gladue case, about what happened with her. Cindy Gladue was a survival sex worker in Edmonton, and an Ontario trucker picked her up in Edmonton. And he felt because he paid her money, he had the right to do what he wanted with her, including stick a knife in her vagina. And she bled to death in a tub. And so right now, originally the guy who committed the crime was acquitted. And because women took to the streets and protested, the Crown looked at the case, and now they're looking at it closer, and come this February, there's going to be a new trial to see if they can get the guy convicted for killing her. Because there's no way that you cannot consent to, it doesn't matter if someone pays you for sex, you cannot consent to them using weapons against you. And then this is the thing about the pipelines, as PJ was talking about. And the Highway of Tears, as you know, we have a lot of women going missing and getting murdered, and this is for the LNG pipeline that they're going to have a men's camp. Whenever these men's camps show up, they bring their life with them, so they bring alcohol, drugs, like their way of life into our community. They're usually in isolated areas, so who's in isolated areas? Indigenous people, reserves. So these men go onto the reserves and they find Native women to go party and drink with them. They use them for whatever they want, and then they throw them away. So the Keystone Pipeline is recently being built in North Dakota. Everyone remembers the fight to stop it when it happened. Well, it's only been not even a year since they started building it. Already 5 Indigenous women have gone missing in that area, and 2 have been found murdered. And it's a big belief that these men are affiliated with organized crime. What does organized crime specialize in? Human trafficking. And it's also believed, especially in the United States there, a lot of the missing Indigenous women there are due to human trafficking rings. And so that's going to be coming into British Columbia. And so we're going to have a lot more missing women. This is Pamela Jean George. Pamela Jean George was a survival sex worker, and in Saskatchewan, I believe, in 1995. And these 3 men, Caucasian men, picked her up. And once again, they figured because she's a sex worker, they could do whatever the hell they wanted with her. And they beat her to death. And then when it came time to go to court, the men got 6 years in prison for beating her to death. Next one. This is Tina Fontaine. Everyone's aware of this case. Tina Fontaine was a young underage girl who was from Saskatchewan, went to go visit her mother in Winnipeg. And due to things that didn't work out, she ended up on the streets. And an older guy picked her up and raped her and killed her and dumped her body in the river. And that's where she was found. And unfortunately, in this case, the guy was acquitted. And he actually admitted to killing her, but he was acquitted. Next. This is Cindy Ledoux. I already told her story about how she's a survival sex worker in Edmonton. Trucker picked her up, used a knife on her, caused her to bleed to death, and was acquitted. This is Sarah DeVries. Sarah DeVries' picture is also here too. Sarah DeVries was a survival sex worker in the downtown east side, and Robert Picton picked her up. And we all know the story what happened on the Picton farm. And so when the Picton farm was finally, looked into, they found her DNA out there, and the Crown decided, because there wasn't enough DNA, or it wasn't body parts, that they would stay the charges. So 20 charges were stayed against Robert Picton, including Sarah DeVries. So the DeVries family is never going to have justice for what Robert Picton did to their daughter.
Do people know about Robert Picton?
Oh, you know about Robert Picton? Serial killer, killed 50 women on his farm? Yes?
You use the word survival or survivor before sex worker. I was wondering what you mean by that.
Yeah.
Okay, so a sex worker is someone who wants to work in the sex industry. And they have the right to say no, and they have control over their job, and they have the right to decide how much they get paid. And so they have the right to say no, and they have choice. So that's a sex worker, someone who wants to do that. A survival sex worker is someone who doesn't want to work in the sex industry, but has to due to poverty or addiction. And they don't have the right to say no, so they don't know if the next date's coming in 10 minutes or 10 hours, so they have to take what they can get. And usually survival sex workers become victims of serial killers and serial rapists. So we use the word survival sex worker to show that these women didn't go live this lifestyle because they wanted to. It's due to addiction, poverty, that they ended up in this lifestyle. Yeah.
I think maybe related to your point about being underprotected too, because of criminalization, they're not able to come forward and report situations of fear and threat because they'll be criminalized
Yes.
rather than who they're fearful of or threatened by.
Yeah, so due to chaos prostitution laws, it's not in favor of the survival, especially the survival sex workers. So to give you guys an example, I worked in the survival sex industry. And in 2001, I was beaten and robbed by a drug dealer. And so I decided to go to the Calgary police about it because I viewed it no different than if a John beat me up and robbed me. And the Calgary police officer looked at me and said, "You made that money illegally, so we're not going to do anything about it." They decided to send out another police officer for the assault. So the other police officer showed up for the assault. And he looked at me, and I had like a busted, blue tie, a busted up lip. And he looked at me and he said, I went by the name Jessica up there. He said, Jessica, I don't know if you know this, but because you're a prostitute, the Crown's not going to do anything about this. No judge is going to help you. He said, but if you go get a real job next week, like say a telemarketer, and a drug dealer beats you up, the judge will do something about that. But for now, judges don't care. Judges do not care about prostitutes. And it was left. That was it. So a drug dealer beat me up and robbed me. And so that's how our I won't say our laws, but that's how our society works. So that's why it's easy for criminals and predators to prey on our women who end up in survival sex trade. Any questions? Yes?
Would you be in favor of the legalization of sex workers, or do you think that there's a better way to do it to avoid violence against sex workers?
We want decriminalization because when you legalize it, then the government just became the pimp. And not only that, but a lot of the women will not fall into the health standards in order to work in the survival sex trade. So that would push them more underground. So we want more decriminalization. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
This is Helen Osborne. Helen Osborne, she was on the she lived in the Province in Saskatchewan or Manitoba. I can't remember exactly where actually. It was something kind of sad. And she wanted to become a teacher. And these men, like 3 or 4 men picked her up and decided otherwise for her. Actually, I have her right here. At Manitoba. She was murdered. One of the 4 predators was charged with her murder. One was acquitted. One was given immunity for testifying. And one was never even charged. So 4 men went out of their way and murdered an Indigenous woman because they knew they can get away with it because it's very racist in Manitoba and Saskatchewan. And only one person, we don't even know how much time the guy got for killing her. And so, she's a beautiful woman. She wanted to go on and become a teacher, and her life was cut short. And it was considered to be socially acceptable because she's First Nations. This is Dawn Cray. Dawn Cray was a survival sex worker in the downtown east side. You might know her brother Ernie Cray, who's a well-known chief or native advocate in British Columbia here. Dawn Cray too was picked up by Robert Picton in 1992, I believe, and her picture's on here too. And her DNA was found on the farm, and same thing with Sarah DeVries. The charges were stayed. So Picton was charged with it, but he was never convicted of it. Next one. Now, here is, so the RCMP had new evidence in these cases here that Picton had murdered these women. They brought it to the Crown, and the Crown decided not to charge Picton with them. Now, what's really interesting about this whole thing is that, okay, let's take a look at the Paul Bernardo case. Paul Bernardo is considered to be a dangerous offender. He's in prison. He's never getting out. He's actually considered a serial killer. If there's a case of proof that he murdered or raped a woman, they'll actually charge him with it and try to convict him of it, even though he's not getting out of prison. In the Robert Picton case, they decided that out of the 49 women he murdered, that they would only convict him of 6 second-degree murders, and they would not pursue any of the other ones, because they said, well, he's already doing life in prison. Why would we want to waste taxpayers' money to recharge him for the other ones? But do you see the difference between the 2 cases? And we believe it's like that because of who their victims were. Paul Bernardo murdered white schoolgirls, Caucasian, middle-class schoolgirls. People would care about that. Robert Picton murdered survival sex workers who were drug addicts, who were homeless, who lived in the ghetto. And so what that case says, actually go back in. What that case says is that it's okay to go target survival sex workers. It's okay to target black women, Native women. It's okay to target poor women because you won't be held accountable for it. So be aware of this. A serial killer went and killed people, and 20 charges were dropped. Versus Tara McDonald. Tara McDonald worked at a Subway as a Subway clerk. She was a college student. She was working a midnight shift. And a guy walked in and was high in crack and smashed her over the head with a hammer and killing her and robbed the place. As a result of her death, because she was a college student, she was Caucasian, the police chief got involved, the premier got involved, like everyone got involved, and they changed the rules that people who worked midnight shifts had to work in pairs of 2, had to have something around their neck, like a button to push if they were in trouble. Everything changed because a college student was murdered. In this case, too, this guy here, he was a 24-year-old everyone remembers the case in 2014, I believe it was. He shot 5 RCMP officers in Brunswick, killing 3 of them. He got 75 years in prison. He has more time in prison than Robert Picton does. He only killed 3 people, and he got 75 years. Where Robert Picton's admitted to killing 49 women, and he got 25 years. So what it says is if you kill the police or someone important in society, they will put you in prison for a long time. They will never let you out. But if you kill a drug-addicted sex worker or a Native or a black woman, you might get 6 years. Next. So we asked the question, so what can we do to challenge this? If this is the way our society is, what can we do to stop this from happening? And we look at that from a place of, getting up and challenging the state, getting up and challenging the court system, getting up and challenging law enforcement. And so we do that by coming together, organizing, picking a campaign, organizing, and having a revolutionary organization. And basically overthrowing the state and saying that we'll not put up with your state-sanctioned violence. We will not allow you to let men murder and kill our women and girls. And we will rise up against you. And so, actually, I'll go back there. That case here is in Mount Poly, where, once again, corporations coming into Indigenous land to destroy their land for profit. So all these Indigenous people got together, and they stopped it. They stood in the way to stop it from happening. Do you remember any more about what happened?
As a result of Mount Poly?
Yeah.
Mount Poly was an Imperial Metals dumping site.
Tailings
pond that breached, and it was structurally deficient, and they knew it and had warnings for years that this was structurally deficient and it was going to be leaking eventually. They needed to reinforce it. They even had work orders that they were supposed to reinforce it, and then they didn't, of course, and it breached, and it got into the Skeena. Was it the Skeena?
Yeah.
And the area of the, whose territory is that? Tahltan, I think it's Tahltan territory. It's in Tahltan territory. It's up at the mouth of the Skeena rivers there, and anyway, it's Imperial no more as a play on imperialism and on the Imperial Metals. So Imperial Metals is a Vancouver company. So they still haven't been held to task for it. I think there was some very minor fines that were imposed, but Mount Poly. Up in Gitxsan territory, north
It's in northern British Columbia.
of British northern British Columbia. Anyway, definitely that's something, if you're looking up Indigenous resistance, that there's ongoing struggles there around forcing the government to get involved and clean this up and hold the company to task on this. And in fact, they just applied and got a permit to restart operations. So not only have they not cleaned it up, they are now reopening the line.
It's really an example of corporate crime and the way in which corporate crime is never dealt with by the criminal justice system at any level in the way that street crime is. Right? If you had this kind of vandalism and destruction and devastation that was carried out in a neighborhood, then the people responsible would be, public enemy number one, and there'd be videos of them all over the place. And who are these wanton criminals? Like the guys that stuck the screwdriver into a few car tires last night. That story's all over the place, and it's like, who can find them, track them down? Yeah, you can destroy an entire ecosystem, people's communities, livelihood, the resources off which they live, and the response is, go again. Yeah, get it going. Fix it up a little bit, and away you go.
So a part of this is a part of our revolution as Indigenous people to overthrow the state is to come together and to challenge and stop state-sanctioned capitalism, I guess you call it. Is that a good word, Jeff?
Yeah. State capitalism, yeah.
Because when it comes down to, they're coming onto Indigenous land, whatever nation owns that land, they never got their permission. And so that's why it's very important that Indigenous people come together and claim that this is our land. You can't do this. You didn't ask our permission.
And I can just show you this right up here in the corner. This is a t-shirt that says "Warrior Up." Ta'a said. Ta'a is a matriarch at the Coaquexton, I'm not saying it right, but the Watch House, which is Coast Salish territory. It's Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish set up a watch house on Burnaby Mountain to observe what Kinder Morgan was doing, and that was right next to where Camp Cloud is parked too, right on the top of Burnaby Mountain. And so Ta'a is a matriarch who's calling for everybody in this climate change movement to warrior up. So it's pretty important that she said that.
So also part of this is that we have to educate people. We have to challenge, have to get out there and change people's minds. So this is Martha Roberts. She runs Grassroots Women. She's a Marxist lady. I've worked with her a lot of things. So we go around and we do presentations on police violence, and we educate people, as I've done here, about the role of police, what police do in society, what police actually do compared to what they say. We show the propaganda. And so we also get together with poor women and working class women, and we show the strength that we have and work together. And so this is us actually here at Quality University back in 2014 doing a presentation on working class women. Yeah. Another part is that we believe in organizing. Once again, we come together, we march the streets, we show our visibility, we show our culture, that we claim space, we claim land. Like, this is our land, and we're going to take it back, and we're going to practice our culture, which was stolen from us by the Queen of England and the Canadian government residential schools, and we're going to march the streets and show them that they didn't win. That, you know, you might have stole our culture and stole our language and, you know, did what you did in residential school, but you didn't win. We're still marching the streets in our regalia and beating our drums. This is the way we've always done it. Before colonization, this is how we did things. And we're still doing it. This is, we're going to mobilize against the police. We're going to mobilize against the army. We're going to mobilize against the state. So here, 100 of us came together. It was March 15th, International Day to End Police Violence. And we mobilized in Vancouver, and we showed up, and we basically called out the Vancouver police, saying how they're responsible for violence against women, how they're responsible for women going missing, being murdered in the city, how they've neglected and allowed things to happen. And so we did this. Now, what's interesting and what you don't know, you don't see this, is back in 2015 in November, 4 of my friends of us got together. A guy in the downtown east side was suffering from schizophrenia, and some people were assaulting him, and the Vancouver police allowed it to happen because he had schizophrenia. And so it was brought to my attention. So I quickly grabbed, other cop watch friends, and we grabbed them. We went down to District 1 police station. We walked in, and we had a sit-in. We sat down, and we refused to leave until the police addressed this. 4.5 hours later, we were inside that same police station. We're sitting in there. We're just sitting there until all these police officers come in. They take us in some other back room, and we basically explain to them, we're not going to leave this police station until you investigate this. You're the police of Vancouver. A crime's happening against a Vancouver citizen. You need to do your job. If you don't, we're not leaving. We'll sleep here today. And finally, because we did that, they actually investigated it and then went to court. And so here's another thing. This is us in Seattle at the, that's me there. This is in Seattle at the Missing Women's March in Seattle. 20,000 women took to the streets of Seattle in January 2018, I believe it was. Earlier this year. And so mobilizing for revolutionary change. So I'm holding a sign that says, when violence against women becomes normal, it's time for a revolution. It's time to change things. Working class women or over police aren't protected. And this here is interesting. This one in the United States here, they were marching the streets because their women were going missing at high rates, and their government in the United States wasn't doing anything about it. And it's due to human trafficking. That's why their women are going missing. Our women are going missing and being murdered due to serial killers in Canada. But still Indigenous women, and in both countries, still aren't doing anything about it. And so instead of America suffering what they're suffering, Canada suffering what we're suffering, we're going to come together. And we're going to challenge the state, we're going to challenge the police, we're going to challenge the military, because they're not doing anything. They're not doing their job. They're not protecting people the way they claim to say that they are. So this is us joining in with the Indigenous North and Native American women, and we're marching the streets fighting for women's rights.